Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Sandrine Ndahiro, and along with my colleague Alice Feldman, we'll be talking about who tells the story, representational agency, the rights of self-determination in filmic and documentary of arts. So just before we begin, I'll just give a brief overview of myself. I am a second-year PhD student in the University of Limerick studying contemporary African literature. And I was currently doing a chapter of mine which deals with the representation of the African landscape through film. And with that, it kind of raised different questions in regards to who gets to tell the story and how some certain times within Western filmic mode, there's negative stereotypes projected onto the African landscape. So this kind of brought this question in regards to the power of film, but then the power of also placing micro minorities at center stage of their own narrative and retelling their own stories. So like this brought about this great conversation with Alice to do a webinar like this in order to start discussing these issues and see what's the positive way of moving forward when it comes to self-representation. So I'll hand it over to you, Alice.
Okay, hi everyone, welcome. I'm really excited about this as well. I am in the School of Sociology at UCD and convene the MA in Race, Migration and Decolonial Studies. And, you know, I just have to contextualize this because I grew up in the 60s when it was all about the power of voice and the politics of knowledge and whose knowledge counts, you know? And in the 70s and then in the 80s and then in the 90s, it was all about the politics of representation, who speaks for whom and under what circumstances. And then it was sort of just kind of looking over this long period of time in the 2000s, because there's always been this conversation between the grassroots and university stuff and people writing about it and people doing the practice. And then like in the 2000s, it just seemed like there was this head-on collision between the grassroots and the whole academic stuff and professional practice, like literally in the context of intersectionality. And it was almost like the question then was, well, who can even hear and why can't people hear? And that was all kind of bringing in the issues of white appropriation, of Black culture, of intersectionality in itself, issues of white fragility. You might have heard the hashtag solidarity is for white women, and all of the things that have come forth with the globalization of the movement for Black Lives Matter. And the sort of kind of coming together, the confluence of anti-racism, decoloniality, you know, all of these different movements. But at the same time, at the same time in the 2000s, there was the social turn in the arts and socially engaged practice. And all of a sudden, there was this debate around, well, when you deal with people and people are participating in your art, then you have all of these ethical issues, and it was all a problem. It was sort of like, oh, you know, we have to do what's all this stuff around ethics and having to honor or have the integrity, the parity between the artist or the maker and the people who are the subjects, right? Even if they're collaborators and participating. And I have to say, I mean, that was in the 2000s. And I mean, I was sort of vaguely stunned, but not surprised that at the sort of level of affront of, well, you know, artistic license and that whole assumption had just kind of gone untouched all of these decades, right? And so, you know, there was that thing, and then just what's been going on in Ireland over the last 10 years with the sort of stepping forth of a vanguard of Black Irish and migrant and people of color artists and scholars and activists and stuff. And I think it sort of got to the point where even recently hearing, you know, oh, well, there are no Black filmmakers, you know, I have to do this work. I'm a white practitioner. Well, there are no Black people making films, or, you know, these sorts of things that, you know, I just thought, okay, picked up the phone. I knew Sandrine was, sorry, I just got this message flashed. I knew Sandrine was doing work on this. So I picked up the phone and we thought, okay, it would be great to have public discussions about this now and start having a collective sort of coming together on, you know, some sense of ethics and practice. So that's me, old, been around, but kind of like, okay, it's time. So.
Yeah, and I think like with what Alice said, like there's this in like present day Ireland now, we're like at this cultural crossroad where it is really, really important to address these questions and see what's like the impactful way of moving forward. So again, like we're kind of we're not producing counter narratives that are again like harmful to those subjects that we're talking about. So this leads to my introduction to the wonderful panelists of Quiver Butterly and Ala. So I'll come to you, Quiver. So if you can just explain to the audience what kind of work do you do, and just a little bit about yourself.
Thank you both, Sandrine and Alice and Ala. Just to contextualize in terms of the sequence of speakers, because I'm very conscious of speaking first, but it's just because I'm in the process of accompanying a Zapatista delegation sort of around Ireland. And so for a point in this panel, I'll be sort of in a moving car with them. So I'm going to mute myself and turn off my video. And then once we're at the venue that they'll speak, I'll rejoin the more generative, collaborative, collective conversation. But so I might locate maybe, I think what I might reflect on a little bit today, perhaps within two contexts. And I'd say one is the sort of the film vignettes that I've been involved in producing, which are, and I'll speak more to that in terms of all of the problematics that go around, I think, representing journeys of refuge seekers, of those making the journey, in the case of those that we've documented sort of across the central Mediterranean, from Libya to Italy and elsewhere, and also from Turkey to Greece, and those living in a state of prolonged, very profoundly disempowering, humiliating limbo in militarized camps in places like Greece, and then trekking across the Balkans in search of lives of more safety and dignity, meaning and choice. I think I'll also locate it in the experience of the last week of a very wide network of folks in Ireland hosting a delegation of our Zapatista compañeras y compañeros, our friends, our sisters and brothers and comrades, who are visiting us from Chiapas in Mexico. And they are speaking to their experiences of 10 years of clandestine organizing, 27 years of working towards autonomous governance in their communities. And then there's 7 principles of good governance, which are very much rooted in a concept known as Caminando Proguntamo. So as we walk, we learn. And the reason I'm referring to this, as well as maybe reflecting upon where I'm physically situated, which is in a house with them all getting ready for sort of an intercambio, a discussion that we're having later with land workers here in Cork, is that I feel, as somebody who engages in some production or making of film vignettes, that I also am learning as I walk, that I also question as I walk. And I think that anything that I've done to date in terms of trying to provide a glimpse into the journeys of those seeking refuge is very much hopefully continually framed by an ethos of a lot of self-reflection, self-criticality, and also an acknowledgement that that we evolve subtly and more overtly, I think, in terms of learning from much more self-represented portrayals of that journey. So specifically in relation to what is known as the quote unquote refugee crisis, or perhaps, yeah, just crisis of militarized borders more appropriately. But I've seen practice that is both, I think, very subtly empowering and subtle and nuanced and grounded in an ethos of care, of ongoing consent in terms of representation. And the vast majority of that is self-authored. I'm thinking of collectives such as Refocus Media Labs in Lesbos, which is coordinated by a group of predominantly Afghan asylum seekers, amazingly courageous, creative, predominantly women. And also men, and similar collectives that I've witnessed over the years in Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, of young people gathering oral histories from their elders, of feminist collectives of indigenous Mexicans in Chiapas, etc., and many others. So I feel the dissonance sitting here in my whiteness, in my various other kinds of privilege in terms of mobility, and I'm conscious that that so much of what has been documented over the past years vis-a-vis those making the journey is predicated either on overexposed vulnerability, so without real consent, I think capturing glimpses of people in their moments of crisis and trauma as they stumble out of boats, as they sit in their wet clothes, in hypothermic shock oftentimes, just having made a journey in which they face their own mortality. It's oftentimes predicated on images of parents trying to pass their children through barbed wire as they try and navigate and circumvent borders that deny them their internationally recognized right to international protection, and even leaving that aside as they try to journey, in a context in which they are so profoundly brutalized systemically by policies that deny them a multitude of rights, and respect. I've also seen I think practices that romanticize resilience, that use that term in a way that puts the onus of responsibility on the backs of those who are already carrying far too much to be resilient. The whole sort of trope of the good migrant, the overachiever, the person who, is visibly successful, and that there isn't space for recognizing that people come, with such a multitude of subjectivities, and sometimes when they get to a place of safety in which they still navigate racism, in which they still navigate diminishment, in which they have to perform their trauma for immigration systems to get access to their rights repetitively, that sometimes they just need a rest, and sometimes they just need to be allowed the space to maybe fragment in a way that they weren't able to on the journey in safety. And so to conclude, I'd say for this part, I'd say my engagement in this after maybe 20 years of working or more in contexts of sort of social movements, having witnessed, again, without fetishizing, but profoundly brave, deeply empathetic communities that have had the privilege of working and living amongst in Latin America, in camps in Lebanon and Palestine and Syria and Iraq, here in different parts of the continent of Africa. But for those over 20 years, I have in total about 5 photos, because I didn't want to be yet another person who came in from outside and extracted people's pain, or extracted people's resistance either, because it can be so reductive, either of those images, that predicates sort of the raised fist and that denies, the hard work and graft that goes into communities surviving, or those that really overemphasize, people suffering. But the reason that I decided to sort of start to document some of the vignettes of people making this journey is because I felt that the subtlety, of those who are journeying, being able to hold both vulnerability and resilience simultaneously, their hopes, their humor, their cynicism, their lived experiences. I didn't find at that stage when I started doing this in 2015 that I saw much of it out there. There's a lot more now because people are self-representing. So I am conscious, and now I'll stop, but that even what we've made in the past few years, the only piece amongst, I'd say, about 20 sort of film vignettes that I could really stand over, without sort of looking back at it and re-examining it and feeling that cringe maybe of like I left, sort of a shot rolling a little bit too long, did that overexpose somebody, even though we collaboratively co-edited it, all our pieces. So there was ongoing consultation with participants. But I see the only piece I can really stand over is actually a short film vignette that we made called Our Sudan, which profiled some of the experiences of profoundly powerful Sudanese Irish activists, women, elders and younger in their support for the uprising in Sudan a couple of years ago, because there's power in it and glimpses of suffering, but also, it's predicated on power. So thank you all. I'm really excited to hear Ala's reflections, and even though my camera will be turned off later, I will be very much listening and present, and then part of the collaborative conversation later. Yay. Thank you.
Yeah, oh my God, that was extremely powerful, especially like in regards to like your continuity with the sense of like self-representation and the over-romanticized notion of the refugee crisis, because I think it's something that in the recent years we've all seen, because like especially just like like front headlines, and again it's something that even when you were saying it, I've never thought about it being like, did those people give consent to take those pictures? And again, how through that representation, it straight away immediately when they came to Ireland, then from those pictures they've already been categorized in this dehumanization category, because we've already seen them suffering and we've already seen them being placed in that subhuman category. So that was like really significant in order for us to kind of even like reframe that in a very localized setting of how like even the refugee crisis is represented in Ireland. And then so I'll come to you, Ala. So again, just with the same question with Quiva, so what kind of work do you do? If you could just introduce that to the audience.
Hiya, thanks for having me here. The way I started is not the average kind of. I started in my teens. I was in, my family were exiled from Libya. At a young age, I've seen a lot of human rights violation. My dad was put on the terrorist list after 9/11. And I grew up kind of visualizing whatever trauma I was going through. When 2011 happened, I got to go to Libya for the first time. And I started documenting the revolution. It was a glimpse of freedom for my country that I thought would have its official freedom. But kind of, it gave me a new path for me to explore. And I then decided to go on and do my BA in photography, and that's where I kind of started finding new narratives and how to talk about human rights in a visual kind of perspective with telling people's story and how to get the full narrative. The projects I did in college, I did one about racism where I titled it Labeled, and I covered people's faces with the name that they were labeled and then showed who they are in their environment. Because when you look at the person, whenever you get that racial slur or whatever it is, that person labeled them, but they are individuals, and I wanted to show that. And I started exploring that. My final year project was Survivors of the War on Terror, where I interviewed Irish hunger strikers and Guantanamo Bay prisoners, and showed the similarities between both. And I also discovered that the way that the hunger strike started in Gitmo was inspired from the Irish hunger strike in the 80s. Shaka Armour, who started the Guantanamo Bay prison Irish hunger strike, used to live in Ireland, and he knew about the Irish history. And it's something that we never would put together. But funny enough, not funny enough, but because I went through what I went through in Ireland, my dad always reminded us, by the way, the Irish went through this. And in the end of the day, there will be brightness some way or another. So that's how I showed the similarities, like how I discovered that both these individuals went through similar things. And at first, I was going to title it The Victims of the War on Terror. And when I did the interviews, I remember one of the individuals, because I promised for the identities to be hidden, said, "We're not victims, we're survivors. If we're victims, that means we did do something, but we're not victims, we're survivors." So yeah, I kept on exploring, and during COVID, I did 2 projects around identity and migration in Ireland, showing the so one was Muslim youth identity, and showing how the Muslim youth do identify themselves as Irish or wherever they're coming from, but there's always a conflict. And then I got commissioned by the Gallery of Photography to shoot family portraits, which I introduced the archive, photographs showing when they first came to Ireland and what they have done in Ireland. So what career they've achieved, what businesses they've done, and kind of breaking that stereotype where migrants are taking our jobs. Migrants are here to build the country as well. And recently, I've had a busy year. I just came back from London, and like I've said, my dad was put on the terrorist list after 9/11. So our life changed. And in 2012, he was delisted after the UN and Interpol had done a full investigation and found that the Libyan government were in the wrong, and the fall of the Libyan government supported that. But at the same time, I didn't have a normal life where an average girl growing up in Ireland would have. I've seen my dad being arrested. I've seen my little brothers being arrested, and one of them being beaten up by the guards at the age of 14. And I'm saying this and I'm emotional because it's still, it gets to me. Like in 2018, my dad, I got arrested. My dad ended up having, by the special branch under the Terrorism Act, and my dad ended up having a heart attack from the shock. So it's something that affects our life until today, but who's kept it together is my mother. And this is what inspired this new project. Whenever we hear about the war on terror, we hear it from a male's perspective, but we've never heard a female's perspective. So I got in contact with a group of women that have, mostly in the UK, that have been affected by the war on terror, by getting arrested and charges, and their family lives kind of changed and how they supported their family and getting their stories. I have the images in the back. The individuals I've promised to, out of ethics, and for them to lead a normal life, because it's hard for them to talk up and speak up, especially coming from, I feel like Muslim women find it so hard to speak up, and I don't know why, but it's something that I'm trying my best to break. But I've promised them that their identities will be hidden. But the project is titled A Tint of Trauma, and we can see the orange effect on how it's affected their lives. So there's pictures of them, like the eyes show the worry, the hand shows the language, and then I've taken pictures of their homes and the streets that they live in, showing how they've been affected and how their everyday life is. So that's how I kind of came about focusing on human rights. Most of the things that I document, I've been affected by myself. So I'm not an outsider. So I get to tell the narrative, and people get to be comfortable telling me their stories in a personal way, instead of an outsider coming and telling their story and leaving, but I have emotional connection to them as well. So yeah.
Can I just, this might be kind of going off and just keep, Quiva, if you have to go, keep this in the back of your mind, because one of the things that sort of jumped out at me as you guys were both talking is this sort of balance between amplifying and extracting, or not even a balance, but a dissonance, a tension between them. How do you, because I think this actually does get at the heart of when you're creating something and the decisions you make and the factors that figure into that and the circumstances and the inspirations and the, you know, all of everything together. How would you guys like to talk a bit about that amplify, extract sort of thing? And maybe Quiva, if you'd go first.
Again, apologies, Ala, because I'm so conscious of the sequence of this, but thank you so much. Yeah, I'm sure everybody who's in attendance today so valued your reflections and the beauty, the power of your work. And I just wanted to acknowledge as well gratitude, I think, for opening up those memories that bring up trauma and emotion and a vulnerability, but grounded, obviously, I think we all got a glimpse of in your very deep strength and survival. So thank you very much. And your work is beautiful. I really look forward to seeing it, not through a Zoom lens, but yeah, on the walls of somewhere beautiful as well, or somewhere significant or symbolic. I'd say in response maybe to that theme, for me and my whatever practice I have, I'd say accountability and orientation. So to whom do we orientate what we're documenting? There's various, I think, different collectives, one of them whose name I'm actually blanking at the moment, but they're based in France. And it's a BIPOC collective of amazing women and non-binary folks who practice decoloniality in not only their filmmaking in terms of what it's informed by, but also in their invitations to those of us who are white, are outsiders, you know, to the context that we're trying to document, to remain grounded in an ethic of accountable care. So on a personal basis, I think similarly, I really resonated with something that Ala said, you know, in the sense of, you know, that in that extractive practice, I think when people come into communities, and sometimes with very good intentions, you know, I'm not saying that everybody goes there with extractive practice at the forefront of their planning or their mind, but I think I'm always struck by particularly film festivals and going to them from time to time, you know, particularly when there's sort of human rights documentaries, etc. And in a way, the dissonance created by, you know, watching things projected, watching people sometimes exposing very vulnerable, very traumatic experiences, and the way that that's held or not held, you know, the lack of pause, the lack of punctuation, that there's sort of the film, and then, you know, there's sort of the wine outside, and, you know, and, you know, the big sort of, you know, din of conversation, and in a way, it feels like the accolades, you know, that oftentimes follow, you know, films they're never recycled back into the communities that they're documenting. And I've seen that play out, you know, on various different levels, from very big sort of film awards to, you know, more humble ones. But I just thought, you know, and I think frequently whenever I see, particularly vis-a-vis Palestine, I'd have to say, as somebody who, having lived there for a chunk of time, speaks Arabic, and maybe through that linguistic bridge, maybe has a bit more of a nuanced understanding of, I think the emotional register, people's humor, people's reflections. But whenever I watch films from Palestine, I always look to the credits, if they're made by outsiders, by foreigners, by internationals, as to who they deem a fixer, because fixers are oftentimes producers of films. They provide linguistic bridge, they provide access, but they also warm this space emotionally to make it a place of safety. And that's where my concern with extractive practice is, in the sense that I think oftentimes when that space is warmed of trust, and people come in from outside and document, moments of crisis or of trauma. I'm thinking here of, this stereotypical representation that is perpetuated over and over of women keening, after the deaths, of their children, of their partners, of their spouses, of their communities, of their elders, that there is such a continual, sort of tired representation of those moments of extreme grief. But there's very rarely, I think, space or presence for sitting with grief in a different way. So I suppose, to summarize, on a personal level, I think the word that is big for me is accountability, decoloniality, in terms of framing, but also orientation. To whom do we orientate, what we produce, and also whom does that serve? And I think that's the difference, as you mentioned at the beginning, Alice, between sort of platform and extraction. Yes, we platform struggles, but how are we doing it significantly differently? And I think Alaa's practice is a very powerful, poignant example of, the radical departure, from, a narrative of victim to survivor, one that paints its complexity. I was really struck, just with a glimpse of those beautiful photos by all of them, but particularly the street scenes, in urban spaces that are navigated when there is threat and surveillance, and I think this extends to the broader theme also of, this conference, or this gathering, this festival, of human rights, and I'm thinking here of the compas that we're accompanying, whom have known periods of, systematic disappearances of their organizers. And for whom the night is not safe. So even in our logistics, as we hiked up Mullock Moor with them yesterday, and Clare and the Burren, and we've had these delightful interfaces, and sorry, that sounds too trite a word, meaningful interfaces with, grassroots organizers, in various parts of the country. But when they travel at night, their main request to us has been to travel in a convoy, that we all have each other's numbers, that one car stops, all cars stop. And it was interesting in terms of that translation that goes beyond language, but translation of context, of trauma, and of survival. But we were explaining that to some of the volunteer drivers, and initially, and it was out of an attempt to make people feel safe. They asked us to translate or to interpret, that Irish roads are, or not roads, but that, there's a context of safety here. There aren't checkpoints, there aren't militias, and the translation or the interpretation back from our comrades here was that they know that, but they said that they've developed a protocol of survival in the midst of disappearances and massacres in their community, and that as they travel across Europe, they hold that protocol with them for feelings of more ease and safety for all of them. So again, I think that impetus to translate beyond, semantic, beyond language, into the nuances of context, and into, ethical practice. And I honestly think that begins, in film schools, that begins in, media studies programs, that begins in, all the interrelated sort of fields. It has to extend to sort of editorial processes. And I think the pressure for people to compromise on that ethical piece, is immense, particularly around news. But I think there are real issues with, I just single out consent forms. They mean nothing. I really think that they mean nothing if it's not an ongoing ongoing practice of sort of active consent, in terms of representation. And that's where I think, some of the collectives that I know, and Alan knows others, and we all know others, but have been mentioned, are really providing the most instructive compass for us. Because as somebody who has witnessed, even in, I'd say, the last 5 years, those who have made the journey, I'm thinking of young Syrian, Afghan, Sudanese, Eritrean, Palestinian, Iraqi, many young people that we met as teenagers getting off the boat in 2014, 2015, or boats, already in their late teens, early 20s, they are producing subversive narratives, that reclaim, that restory, and that re-script, these such reductive sort of framings of their subjective lived realities, both in the passage, but also what preceded it, what they're doing in the context that they're living and working in now. And two young people that come to mind, two sisters, sorry that I'm not trying to place them in their age, but they are younger, but are the Mardini sisters, Yusra and Sara. Yusra was, and they're both swimmers. They both sort of brought the boat that they were traveling to safety in a Greek island a few years ago. But Sara particularly, is, and Yusra is an Olympic swimmer, but Sara is doing such interesting work, with a really interesting sort of art scene in Germany, and she and many others are restoring and reclaiming, grounded in an ethic of accountability to their communities, and they and so many others, I think, need to be our instructors, our teachers in this process. And sorry for speaking so long, Ala, but yeah, and I might have to mute and turn off my camera, but I will be very much listening very attentively as we move. And thank you.
Alice, can I get you to repeat the question, please?
We were talking earlier on, Quiva had mentioned something about extracting, that extractive process, but at the same time, what you might be trying to do in terms of amplifying or platforming, and how you have come to create your ethics and practice around that.
I definitely agree with what Quiva said. I think, especially with the film festivals and so on, having we document something that is so, sorry, I'm muting myself for a second. We document something that is so emotional and so traumatic, and so I feel like it's something that I want to hit a nerve. But when it comes to galleries and festivals and everything, it becomes like something for a view, which it's not something to be viewed. It's something to kind of make an impact, and that's what I aim for. So I definitely agree with Quiva about festivals. And it's something I always think of. So whenever I say impact, I looked at, like, whenever I'm making a project, I'm looking at how is the best way that I show this work? How is the best way? I don't know, not to romanticize viewing it. I don't know if that's the best word for that. But like for this project, I was thinking, with the 20-year anniversary coming up, can you give me 1 second? I just need my bit to stay quiet in the background. Apologies. I live in a house that has more, like, nearly 8 individuals, so apologies about the noise in the background. So when I was thinking of how to exhibit this work, the Tints of Trauma, I was thinking of having a zine that becomes an exhibition. So you open up and you can kind of plaster it everywhere, because by plastering it everywhere and people walking by, it kind of doesn't, like, walking by and stopping and looking at it, it doesn't make it, oh, that me having a glass of wine or a glass of drink and looking at it. No, like you look at it and you start reading the caption, or maybe listening to the audio or something like that, that you can get the same feel. I remember when I had an exhibition for my graduate exhibition in the Gallery of Photography, for the survivors of the war on terror, I wanted to give that kind of claustrophobic feeling whenever you're viewing the image, the video. So I had 2 panels on each side, and then the face panel in front of you. So I had the side profile of each individual, and then I had their face, their eyes, and their mouth kind of deducted. And it was in a really small room that kind of I wanted them to feel that claustrophobic feeling that the people imprisoned were feeling. So that's what I always think. It's not how I make the work only, but also how a person sees it. And also with each project, I really try my best that in the really end, one of the people that I'm telling their stories to come out with a skill as well. So a storytelling skill or a photography skill, or get them to make their own artwork, because in the really end, they'll, like, I'm not going to always be here, but that person is always going to is going to be there, and he might have, or she might have, narratives that can be told different to the way I see them as well. So yeah.
I think that's really powerful in regards to like that collaborative approach that you have with your participants or subjects, because I think that's something that I've started to think about, especially like now going into the medium of film, is like because I'm working on a documentary and like in regards to like the changing nature of Irishness, and even that I've been asking myself, like, I don't want to fall into that trap of, because I'm doing it in Carlow, where I'm from, so I don't want to go there, be like, oh yeah, tell me your traumatic stories, tell me the racism you've experienced in Carlow, bye, and come back to Limerick. So I think that's a really clever way of that collaborative, like by the time that they finish talking to me and creating that trust with that skill, because at the end of the day, storytelling should always empower the person who is telling the story. And as you say, like, they should be able to talk to me and then they can create their own story. Because again, like, whenever it comes to documentary or anything like that, you're only capturing a specific moment or a specific narrative. But as we've like talked about today, like everyone, like there's full of narratives there. So it's really important to empower that. And I think even goes back to like previous question in regards to who does it serve, and I think that's something that I always struggle with in understanding. So like even from like my PhD in regards to like contemporary African literature, even when it comes to like contemporary African writers writing about like environmental crisis and like the trauma there, I'm always like, who is the intended audience for that? So I think that's something that throughout all the practices we're always asking. So like I think that like with what you're saying in regards to reclaiming that narrative and ensuring that skills are provided to that participant that they can later on go and make their own film, is something that maybe even the audience will find really inspiring, because it's such a simple thing to do and it's such like an impactful thing, because again, you're not romanticizing their story, because then by the time they finish talking to you, they have skills that again will probably make them like provide them with a safe space to retell their story, but like in an appropriate manner, because they'll be repeating what you've taught them, as opposed, and like, you know, like, and if someone else was to come along into that community and ask them to retell their stories, like you would have been like the guiding light in that regards to like know what appropriate ways to do it. So like that's a really powerful and impactful way of looking at it. So thank you for sharing that.
Sandrine, can I just add one more thing? I think even talking about people's, like getting a person to talk about their trauma and everything, and we sometimes leave, we always have to think of the effect of that leaving, because they kind of brought up so much emotions and it resurfaced. I think also when we're documenting or photographing or making artwork with those individuals, we need to think they need counseling after what they've told us, because a lot of them, it resurfaces and it does affect their lives again. And most of them might have suffered from like mental health. And it's something we always forget. Okay, we got the story and we leave, but there is consequences of us leaving as well that we have to take into, and like we have to put it into our thought. Like a lot of us, like whenever we might get funding for a project or something like that, always consider what the aftermath of the individual might be. So put in, like, think of counseling, think of something like that, instead of just leaving as well.
I'm actually not, and I was listening to that reflection. We're not in the cars yet, so I might just offer one myself as well, if that's okay. But as somebody who works in psychotherapy and trauma, I really resonate with what you're saying. I think that there is a real, again, duty of care when people are documenting communities that have endured and survived trauma, in terms of, again, that sort of concept of accountable care. And there's increasingly, I sort of think, in all sort of disciplines and educational milieus, whether that's media studies or filmmaking or, multiple ways of representation, that there really has to be more psychoeducation, sort of woven in to people's understandings. And I'd say towards that as well, I've been sort of thinking a lot recently about the sort of the concept of co-regulation, and how oftentimes when people have experienced trauma, the impacts of that, are sort of cognitive, so the brain, but they're physiological, the body, and they're also the autonomic nervous system. And when you think of people whose systems in a way have been flooded, with cortisol and adrenaline, repetitively, oftentimes they experience what is known as dysregulation. And I think there's a real role in terms of punctuated space. So if we're going into a space to document, of being in the most grounded sort of space that is possible ourselves, and through that process to try and create, what can be a very bodily felt sort of place of safety for people. So the more grounded, the more regulated we are, oftentimes, our autonomic nervous systems, you pick that up body to body. And I find within that, those spaces for more authentic consent can be opened, because it's not sort of that flurry of activity. There's a stillness. And if that stillness can be created, with silence, with care, with that warming of the space, then I think people are in a much better position vis-a-vis self-representation and actual consent to be able to voice, what they're comfortable with, what they're not comfortable with, and whom does it serve, oftentimes, to reopen these deeply traumatic memories without that holding space, that sacred space, of holding memory and experience. And that's where I think that extractive experience can so easily come into it again. And that's where I think community-led self-representation, I think the fact that you have lived trauma yourself, and you're, sitting in a space with other women and men whom have also, and there's a commonality of lived experience with all of its differences as well, of trust. And again, I'm just reminded of how sacred your voice is within this. And I have to now jump into a car, but I will be listening attentively with another kind of struggle with our lovely visitors here. But thank you.
Thank you both. And one thing I think what's really emerging from this conversation is shifting how we use, there's certain terms that we just say all the time without really thinking, that have become, so for example, transforming how we really engage with the notion of safe space, because it's being, how terms can sort of lose their robustness, and so now safe space is used all the time. And the depth of what that really means, I think you both really brought a lot of richness to, and even the notion of warming the space and all of how, and like maybe from safe space to sacred space. Because one of the things Sandrine and I were talking about is, you know, when you give your story to someone, when you receive someone else's story, that's also a sacred exchange of experience, of trust and things like that. So what you've both been talking about in terms of creating the space and the relationship within that, and how the relationship building creates the space. And it's not just at the beginning, but it's all the way through the process, and that exchange, whether it's skill making, whether it's the collaboration that emerges, but then also to the space in which it's experienced or shared, but with other people. So the viewing space, the space in which it's, you know, no one, you know, people, you know, there's a lot of debate and discussion about the white cube and, you know, the gallery and things like that. And yeah, it's that, and I think, and it's interesting. I mean, maybe it's an example of just how far terms we use just lose their, you know, it becomes more of a means of expedience, right? Get the consent form, create the safe space. But then, you know, there's still that practice of the wine reception at an exhibition, which is kind of like, that's sort of like an easy one that can be rethought. But then there's all the institutional stuff, but the sacred space in which it's shared. And how you as a maker of the work, you know, that's also part of the process. You don't just hand your piece over. So I think that is a really powerful thing about what do we mean by safe space, and that it also links into the other element of duration, because it's the duration of the project and the process that continues on, and also of seeing and including in your relationships with people that you're working with and whose stories you're engaged with in that process, seeing that they have lives that go on. You know, they grow up, they go on to make their own films. They have their own narrations, the ongoing life of the piece that you make, because that is a moment in time that has a life beyond just the you know, the role of the project or the launch of it. You know, that is constantly shared, and there have been things that I've been involved in making with people that were so powerful and so intimate, and they themselves, like there was some work that we did, and people, they were taking it with them to show with people, families, you know, get-togethers, but it seemed like outside of the context of that immediate relationship, I still didn't feel like we could post those pieces. Even though the people who made them were really excited about them and they're like, yes, 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 but that was also very much in the moment of the life of that relationship and that collaboration. So yeah, so duration, Quiva, you were talking this morning, knowing people their whole lives, knowing that their lives go on, and also this notion of just, oh, safe space, we're good. But really making that a very rich space in which to create ethical practice. That's also part of the artistic process as well, and the political one.
Yeah, and that moves on to the next question in regards to like those artistic practices and the ethics around that. So we'll start with you, Ala, in regards to what do you find to be the worst violation of people's self-representation in the field you're working on?
Actually, earlier I said that a lot of Muslim women find it hard to speak up. I think it's not them finding it hard to speak up. It's them finding it hard that if they speak up, their words might be changed. And I think that has happened a lot of times, and that distrust that they've grew kind of emphasizes, like it went around. So apologies, I have a really bad flu, so thank God it's not corona, so every single time I'm coughing, I'm fine. So I think for the women to trust me, and I think they trust me because I've been through this, is a big responsibility. And sometimes a lot of filmmakers or journalists or artists don't value that trust sometimes. And like, I remember when I came to make the captions for my images, I was transcribing, but sometimes the sentence didn't make sense. So like, from as simple as me messaging the woman, be like, is this, I transcribed the interview, but the sentence doesn't make much sense. What exactly do you want to say? And then she'll send me a message with exactly what her message was. So even after you finish shooting the project and everything, there needs to be a communication for that trust to continue. And then there's also one of the image, actually this, sorry, that image of a room. So at first I had, this individual hasn't told her parents or her family what she had suffered when the police came over to her house. Her parents and family were away, and she's the only practicing individual in our family. And a lot of times her family kind of, I don't like, they blame a lot of things for her being practicing, her not leading a normal life and everything. So she hadn't fully told them about what happened to her with the MI5, and that they came home and they did what they did. So I had a picture of her living room. So I sent her the picture and I was like, what do you think? She was like, can you please change it? If my parents see that picture, or anyone that I know, will straight away know it's me. So I changed luckily I had another backup image that kind of is new furniture at home and everything, that I changed it to that image, and she was like then more comfortable. So I think keeping that connection with the individuals, and not changing anything that they've told you, making sure they're okay with everything is important. So
Definitely. Is my reception okay, just in terms of offering a reflection on that?
Yeah.
Okay, for now at least. Thank you. I'd say similarly, as Ala, has covered that aspect of communication, of ongoing consent, of having sort of a generative or collaborative process, whether that's in editing or in feeding people's quotes back to them, in their participation in the editorial process is so important. And in terms of a specific or maybe a generalized example of sort of practice that has that very uncomfortably, I was thinking, how could I locate that just down to one, because there are so many. But I'd say specifically vis-a-vis that question of sort of platform versus extraction, of the countless sort of social movement struggles and human rights defenders, etc., almost entrusting these very sacred stories oftentimes of organizing, of suffering, of survival, into hands that hold them very clumsily and very unaccountably. And that's not just, I think, sometimes sort of news, and its reductive nature by virtue of the fact that it moves so quickly, but certainly, sort of documentary makers too. And I'm thinking of sort of practices that I've glimpsed in which the intimacy that is established, when there's sort of observational documentaries, which I do not engage in personally, just because I find them so deeply problematic unless they're made by people within communities themselves in terms of self-representation. But I think when people are sort of the subjects or the protagonists of observational documentaries, the longer documentary filmmakers spend.
I think we lost her there.
Yeah, I think she just froze there. I just wanted to kind of touch on with what you were saying there, Ala, in regards to your responsibility and like the sheer magnitude of that, of ensuring you don't retell the story. Because I think I've noticed that as, again, like I've only done one documentary, but like in regards to telling stories and being a writer, there's always this sense of like whenever you're thinking of the audience that, I don't know, I feel like sometimes it's very easy to write for an intended audience. So like you're kind of diluting your own experiences in order to appease the audience. And I say this like in regards to, I remember last year I wrote my first personal essay after like my leaving cert. I had never touched a personal essay up until then. And I was writing it on like in this sense of the authorization of Black Irish people, but then also of those in direct provision. And I remember writing this extremely personal essay, but being like, oh, if I talk about this, is it too depressing? Or am I going to like be placing myself like in that victim mentality that when people see me, that they'll see it as, oh, okay, she's experienced racism, or she's experienced that sense of duality. And I think it's something that the more I write, I really understand like I have the responsibility of retelling like my own story and shaping my own narrative, regardless of who's going to be reading that. Because again, people can impose their own view on that, but it's like really important to do that. And I remember even with the documentary on Silencing Black Voices, again, we thought about it like when we're talking about like racism in Ireland. It's such a huge topic to talk about, and again, we didn't want to impose certain narratives being like, okay, I've been called the N-word, so have you, because again, that's something completely different. And I remember a way that we did that was by really asking the participants that took part into like recording their own voices and their own story, and we did not edit any element of that, because again, that was a real power of it. Because I think there's like a vulnerability in someone telling their story, and whenever it comes to people editing or anything like that, certain times if you edit a story, you are kind of discouraging the person to tell their full truth, because it's like, oh, this will only match for the audience, you know. So I think that's the same even like with literature, and it's something that I've really come like very have like an intimate relationship with now, like doing like being like an editor-in-chief for an apologetic, where when we were getting essays and we were getting stories like which were very personalized stories on like the changing nature of Irishness and everything like that, like in that empower like the power and the responsibility of ensuring that whenever we're giving feedback, it was like constructive criticism, like in regards like the grammar or anything like that. It wasn't in the way someone was telling their story, because again, that would have taken a sense of bravery to retell that story. And again, if we're trying to like set up a platform to empower and amplify these voices by sometimes suggesting that, oh, maybe the audience might not like this or something like that, again, you're taking away from their narrative and you're falling trapped into this sense of ethics that you were talking about. So that's just something that popped into my mind when you were talking about that collaborative element, that even when it comes to translation, that you're ensuring that once the person sees that story, that again, one, they'll feel proud to see it, and two, like they'll feel safe in the company and know that you've trusted their process and you've trusted their story and like have retold it in the most authentic way, where again, it should leave them feeling like a sense of pride and reclaiming their narrative, as opposed to being like, oh, Ala or Sandrine is just another person who's taken my story, reconfigured it to match their own narrative and not give like a positive experience or like a realistic depiction of the lived realities. And I think that's something that it's really important and people really need to take into account whenever it comes to like the representation of lived realities, because some lived realities, again, they are full with trauma, they are full of dark moments, but again, you just can't, I don't know, like shine like rainbows into it to like depict this like unrealistic element of it, because again, like that's a false narrative that you're projecting onto people.
Well, can I just say real quick, because something really inspired me about this last part of the conversation around there is, I mean, in terms of process, there's that process where, and that intimate relationship in this cultivated safe space in a genuine sense, and then there's that sacred exchange of the sharing of the story, right? Now that might, if we look at that as the first part of the process, it doesn't necessarily mean that that has to be part of the product. It could be after the stories are shared, then there's another, if you even just have in your mind, okay, well, now we can have a conversation about how would you like this story to be, what form would you like it in? What part do you want it to become part of? What is shared outside, you know, as part of the project? Do you know what I'm saying? Where someone can have that space to just tell that story in its entirety, you know, and whole, right? And then it's another collaborative process to say, well, here's kind of where I was going with the project, or what inspired me to do this work. How would you now like to, maybe there's like another level of telling of that story, or the person retelling that story in a way that speaks to what you know, if it's a film that you're doing, or an exhibition, and then with an eye toward that, the safe space of the context in which the work is viewed.
I definitely agree with you, Alice, and I'm doing that, funny enough, for my PhD. So my PhD is Breaking Stereotypes of Muslim Women Through Visual Arts. And I can't tell, I am a Muslim woman, I am a practicing woman, but I can't tell everyone's story and how their struggle is with either wearing the hijab or wearing the niqab, or being a Muslim woman that practices, that doesn't wear the hijab, or being from a Shia background, or being from a Sufi background, or being from a Sunnah background. So I'm getting the women to come together and then sit down, have conversations, and make their own artwork. And then, but me not directing them how to make the artwork, but kind of like, just like I said earlier, like with my other projects, I kind of like give someone a skill, but this time it's we all work together to improve our skills. And like I'm still at the start of it, that's why I haven't mentioned it yet, but it's interesting how the conversation is going, and seeing how especially women that have never expressed themselves through in the arts world, how they're going to come up with these creative thoughts. Is it through writing? Is it through video? Is it through photography? Is it through drawing? And what's even interesting is I might have my kind of thought of what my stereotype, like what people might think of me when they first see me, and the stereotypes I would get. But I think each woman individual would have a different stereotype that people will think about whenever she's walking past, especially a woman that covers. So yeah, that's the thought process that I'm going through, but I don't know how it's gonna, I have 4 years to explore how that's gonna unveil.
Well, yeah, because again, it's interesting, and because I'm always rethinking, you know, ideas that are, you know, have become very common in practice. So the use of arts in, you know, or skill sharing, and even just to think, it's an amazing process. And then you think, well, if a person, it's the first time they've ever used a creative way, or an art, or a form of art, or a new skill that you've shared with them, it might be the first time they're using it. That doesn't mean, you know, so they're doing it for themselves, and that moment is for themselves. That doesn't mean that they want their first ever drawing to be, or photograph to be, part of the final public exhibition. You know, so again, it's like thinking in terms of layering, and rather a means to an end. That, you know, when people talk about the process is the whole thing, the process is the whole thing, and everything comes back to the process and the person, the people who are engaged in that.
And maybe towards that concept of sort of layering, you know, I'm really thinking here of that term, the white cube, you know, that the white cube does not layer, you know, oftentimes, and it commodifies oftentimes these processes. It sort of too, I think, and thinking, particularly hearing of Ala's, that, you know, in a way, the academies oftentimes, you know, tokenization of voices and essentialization of voices. So one person is expected to act as a representative for a very broad, diverse, you know, layer, you know, and how often of a lack of understanding nuance to all community. But yeah, I'm reminded particularly here in some interviews that we did with Massey activists, which we sort of titled "Nothing About Us Without Us," in which they spoke to that experience of being the token voice, you know, the token person in the picture, the token representative, as if, you know, one authentic, quote unquote, community voice could rectify the inherent whiteness of NGOs, you know, the inherent whiteness of all of these spaces. So I'm thinking here as well for those who are self-representing their experiences, that burden of responsibility that they also carry on their backs of, you know, having to really continually broaden, you know, build those layers, push out the confines of the white space, you know, into a place that is generative, you know, and that is, you know, authentically authentic, that can represent nuance and contradictions and complexities in a way that values and honors them. But yeah. But I'm so looking forward to reading your research, Ala, to seeing it too. Yeah, well done.
There's still 4 years for that one.
Bravo. May it unfold as it will unfold. But yeah, great that you're on that journey. Yay.
I think, Quiva, you made a really poignant point in regards to like the tokenization of voices, especially I think it's something myself and Alice were talking about with how Ireland, like in the last 2 years, like, you know, the conversations of diversity and inclusion have been at the forefront of it. And again, where we've had these national conversations, and like even like, let's say with topics like the changing nature of Irishness, and again, who gets to speak to that changing nature, and it leads back to the question of what Alice would have said like at the very start in regards to like how, you know, like a lot of there's this excuse being like, okay, well, we can't make a documentary about Black lived experiences because there's no Black documentarist or traveler documentarist, where again, you're not really searching for it, because I think through that, then like there's been this sense of like where if there's one person from like a marginalized community that speaks about the injustices or like create talks about this need to really create like a new dynamic sense of representation, like they are projected on that responsibility of carrying on that load of authentically representing their whole community like in a homogenic sense, as opposed to, again, like with what Alice saying, like it's unique and interchangeable and fluid at the same time. So that's something that is really interesting, especially just like in the current political climate of Ireland, and like the way we're having these conversations about the need for diversity, but again in a realistic and positive manner, as opposed to falling trap into that description. So I was just letting you know with the audience just to send in any Q&A, and then we'll answer them throughout. So we have one from Sinead. So I'll just throw this out, and then Ala or Quiva, you can jump on. So how do we continue this conversation? Like, how do we encourage best practices without being overly prescriptive? Do we prioritize developing a network of artists and community leaders telling their own story, or first forefront working with in-group artists who are going to tell others' stories regardless, so we would benefit from guidance and questioning how those stories are told? I don't know who wants to take the question first.
I don't mind taking it if Quiva is okay with that. So continuing the practice, I think the collaborative kind of work, giving the person a skill, and then that kind of continues on. But when it comes to making artwork, I don't think it's the best to go to community leaders, because a lot of community leaders might not represent that other person. Like I come from a Muslim community in Ireland, and we have this one representative that always talks on our behalf, but he doesn't represent me. He doesn't represent another Muslim. Like I would say, he represents the organization that he speaks upon, but that's about it. I think with social media, especially, you can now get people from that community that are not leaders, and each person has their own representation of who they are and their own experience and their own story. So as much as I know a lot of artists would go to, like for my community anyways, they'll go to a local mosque, we call it the Islamic community, the ICCI, but you're not getting a various range of Muslim people that have experienced different things, and it's just focusing on one people, and those individuals are those that go to that mosque, but you're not getting a variety. So I wouldn't recommend going to community leaders. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
I'd echo that in terms of witness. That really resonates. Again, Ala and Sandrine, that so often, and I'm just thinking the gender frame here as well, that oftentimes community leaders end up being men, and that in that approach, and I've seen that happen by galleries and NGOs and academic projects, and the intention is good in that outreach, but even that assumption, and I'm definitely resonating what you said, Ala, in terms of that representative voice, who I'd say represents himself more than the community, but in the sense of that it so diminishes, the huge wide range of experiences that exist. So I personally say go to the youth, and really just engage in that generative process, because the emergent voices I find, certainly having witnessed in Ireland of folks of your age, Ala, and younger, and Sandrine, is profound. I really see them as, everything breakers, in the most amazing way, stereotype breakers, stereotype, reshapers, restoriers, and it really feels like they are really, in many ways, a generation that is building upon, the invisibilization of those, who were before, and staking out that ground and reclaiming, a voice that is complex and that can hold contradiction, which is so important. And I'd say also maybe a reflection vis-a-vis Sinead's, comment also in terms of sort of building those networks and really integrating sort of practice that is not prescriptive. I think it is, again, if we're gonna borrow from our Zapatista comrades, Caminando Proguntamo, we need to remain unstatic within that, right? So walking, we learn, and recognize also, I think, the need to build spaces of compassion and care, because I think oftentimes people are so afraid of getting it wrong that they don't work to try and, sort of knead that dough and collaboratively make something that more arcs towards as right as we can be, as accountable as we can be, as caring as we can be, and sort of warming that space as well. But certainly in a non-prescriptive, generative way. And I'd say the only way that can really address that, so it doesn't become prescriptive, again, is centering the voices of those with lived experience, and whether that is, not to place the burden of education on their backs, to educate sort of us and educate practitioners to add to everything that they're already carrying and doing. But I'm thinking here, even if it was video format, sitting down with you, Ala, sitting down, with other folks that can be located, and documenting those reflections, while saying in a way that they're always a work in progress, and having that as a format where people have to listen, maybe in the stillness of really listening to learn versus listening to respond to narrative, which is something I think with this particular visit we're all really sitting with, because the meetings are very long, and cover a lot of history, and it's an invitation to people not always to be listening to respond. But yeah.
Well, one thing that I'm thinking of now is there's how all this plays out at the individual level of the maker, practitioner, whatever, but also the way that our institutions and sectors shape a lot of this, because on one hand, and especially with this thing about organizations, so like arts organizations, galleries, they're all like, you know, everyone's like, work with an organization because they're more legitimate than individuals, right? And I remember a historian telling me once, because I'm always like, we were talking about like, historians never do interviews with living people. And there's this, I was kind of joking, like, you know, it's always got to be in the archive, something on print. So I'm like, so you would take something written on a napkin 100 years ago, you know, as legitimate story, right? Rather than a person telling their story about that sort of thing. And they're like, well, people are not to be trusted. You know, their stories aren't trustable, right? So there's this real interesting sort of paradox here, because, you know, a lot of organizations or funders, they're like, work with the organization or find the representative of the community at the mosque, at the NGO, because people really aren't trustworthy with funding or with their stories. But then on the other hand, there's this sort of, but part of that might also be because they don't trust the individual maker to create the relationships and to establish either whether it's their skill or whether they think about it or don't think about it. But because at the end of the day, it's about the relationships you establish with people, whether you're contacting youth through social media or whether you're meeting with individual communities, because that takes time and it takes resources, and you really have to have a stake in what you're doing. This isn't just something, oh, I'll do another project, or, oh, I do documentaries, but I do them on all kinds of things. It doesn't matter what the topic is, I do documentaries, you know? So it's this weird thing about, yeah, I mean, and I think a lot of the institutional things and funders like push people into go for the NGO rep. Yeah, so because relationships are messy and they're contradictory. So the gallery or the people who commission or the people who are supporting the making of the art, if that's where, if you're getting funding or support, or you want to be, you know, if you want access to a gallery space or whatever, there's sort of like, you know, maybe there's of course liability and stuff like that, but it's, they have to, and I suppose maybe when we start making demands or saying, well, this is a messy business, this relationship thing, you know, my process, you've got, if you want this, or you want to support this project, you also have to support that messiness. I don't know, sorry, I'm just kind of rambling on about that now.
No, I totally agree with what you're saying, and I think it goes back to what Ala was saying, like in the power of social media, especially now, like where, again, as I say, like where stories from marginalized communities and from those like from like the fringe of society, like they are like, there is like a need and a yearning to learn them and to like hear them, and again to kind of contribute to this changing nature of Irishness. So like even when it comes to like things like migrant stories and depicting a positive aspect of it, and to how again like they're contributing to the cultural richness that exists in Ireland. But again, I think the downfall of social media is a lot of like organizations that you were saying, Alice, like they'll go to Twitter and see like, okay, who's making the most noise about X and Y, and like they get to like represent all of like, I don't know, like the Black experience or anything like that. And like I have experience of that, like of when I'm contacted to do a talk, and you know, like there's always this misconception like my PhD has to do with racism. I'm like, nope, like I'm doing it on contemporary African literature, like that's nothing to do with what like I'm passionate about, like in regards to like my lived reality. So I'm always like, I speak out just because I'm Rundi's Irish person, so of course like my duality there, like of course I'm going to speak about racism, but that has nothing to do with my PhD, because again like I'm a multifaceted individual where I'm just not one thing. And again, it's because like a lot of the times these organizations or people haven't done the research to know that my PhD has nothing to do with that. They just go online and like, okay, so she talks about racism, let's get her to talk about like racism, mental health. I'm like, you know, there's other people who do that, and I think there is a responsibility of people, like when you do get contacted and given this opportunity, it's very easy to be like, yes, like, you know, my name will be out there or I'll get permission, but like you're not going to be doing a justice for it, because like if you're not, I know, like for me, like I wouldn't be a mental health expert, and like yes, I know about racism, but that's my own experience of it. So like I would do such a disjustice if I was to go into a panel and talk about the two, because there's other people which are already leading the work. So I think when it comes to things like that, even with documentary, film, any photographs, everything like that, it really is the responsibility of the individual as well. Like when they are contacted, to just know sometimes, like just because you're from that minority group, like sometimes you just don't have all the lived experience, and you wouldn't be able to depict that experience. So like it is really important to like do the sense of like sharing that platform and being like, okay, no, I'm only new into documentary, but I know my friend Ala who does this, but again she specifies in this, because again, like by doing that, by like not sharing that space and not creating that community, you know, with what we were talking about, like that safe space, then again we're falling into these tropes of what we're talking about, like with the ethics of representation. And I just think like that's just something that came into mind when I was talking about media, and like again how some people have self-appointed themselves to be like the spokesperson of like Black Irish community, where again you're like, no, but I don't go through that. Like you can't, if you're talking about like racism being like, again, like something that is I don't know, with the experiences that go there, like the magnitude of it and everything like that, it's different from person to person, and you're talking about that, you're trying to like, I don't know, educate the rest of the Irish public. But then if you're like, oh, we all experience this, we all, like, you know, like there's a distinction between we and I. And I think that's something that I'm always so self-aware whenever I'm doing a talk or writing anything. I always say I. So just because I don't get misquoted as being like, Sandrine has said that all Black people think that Ireland is racist. Again, it's like my distinctive and local intimate relationship with my understanding of the identity and everything like that. So I think it's something like moving forward whenever it comes to like the ethics of representation, to really talk about and understand the responsibility of when you do get contacted to take part in creative practices, that again, sometimes just because you're from a minority background or just because you're from that marginalized community, again, you don't represent the we and the collective of it. That again, like sometimes it is just better to be like, I am not the best person for this, but please go contact Ala or anything like that, because again, like it just creates like just a sharing and a collaborative, and it's just going to create this like more authentic element of it, as opposed to just again having one person on Twitter being like, this is how I feel and this is how every Black person in Ireland feels, because again it's so counterproductive and something that gets me so mad into being like, you know, we should really be sharing that platform and amplifying like lived realities, and again like authentic lived realities, and just understanding that sometimes you just don't know the story, and pass it on to someone who does and who will reflect on that. And that's why like with what we was saying, like going to the youth, because again like my little brothers would have a completely different experience of racism or like their understanding of Irishness from me, from my parents. Like that's 3 different generations there. So like understanding that like there's a power in that.
I definitely agree, especially with the youth point. I think even getting them to talk empowers them, and that empowers the next generation or generation after. I think a lot of like, even when it comes to my, like I keep on saying my community because it's the one that I can reference to, it's always old men, like, or like there are some women, but we don't have youth speaking up, that we need to work on the youth speaking up and getting them to talk and working on that. Because like you said, Sandrine, the older person might experience something else to the younger person. And I also seen Sinead asking how to bring on people from the community and everything. Like you said, Sandrine, social media, but even if you look for artists in the community or individuals in the community, it's easy to find. It's not like you don't actually have to go to those organizations. Like a simple post on social media, it gets shared easily. Or even if you start Googling artists, diverse artists in Ireland or something like that, a name's going to pop up, and then you can message that, and then that person can message another person, like you said, Sandrine, and just it becomes a network, and that's how it is.
Oh, and it also, one thing I was thinking, Sandrine, when you were saying, you know, sharing the space if you're contacted, and it also so the person who's contacting you, right? Could you, I'd like you to talk on this, or I'm doing a thing on this, you know, you're Black, you know, you can talk about racism. There's that element. And then there's also it helps complexify things for the person who's contacting you. So like in terms of, you know, like, so Quiva has studied and practiced in issues around trauma and psychology and things like that. And that there are people, it's the lived experience for sure, but it's also people who have done work in, who have skills, who have studied, who have an experience of practitioner work in different areas like mental health, or like employment, or things like that, or discrimination. You know what I'm saying? So there's the lived experience, but also the fact, because I think particularly around race and migration, it's really common where, you know, if you need an accountant, you go to somebody who's trained. But sometimes in the white community, whether it's documentary or whatever, it's like, I have this theory, right? So suddenly anyone can talk about race. I'm finding that a lot in the equality, diversity, and inclusion initiatives that are all over the place. People can be on these committees and on these boards and making policy. They don't have to have any experience at all in any of these areas in any context, right? Suddenly, oh yeah, you can have your own kind of theory. Anyone can, you know what I mean? So when you put people on to other people in your network, and people who have those specialisms as well as the experience as well, it kind of also shows, educates that type of network of practitioners that they're here. It's not, you know what I mean, that people actually have done this work. Artists have actually worked in these areas, and documentary. Well, here are people who are trained in documentary. Why don't you ask them about it, you know? Or even, you know, maybe that could open up a space where maybe the sharing of space by a privileged filmmaker or something is about stepping aside, because I think that's also with the moment we're in, where white people especially, you know, using your privilege to make change. Well, that is also about stepping aside, or encouraging someone who is learning, or you share your funding with, or you do an apprentice. So you switch the power relations, you support them in doing the work that they're meant to do. Sorry, that's another sort of rant about, yeah.
I'd just say that really resonates, Alice, and all in the sense of that stepping aside. Definitely, I think both in terms of privilege and racialized privilege, and in terms of age as well. I'm really conscious, you know, and I do think that there's always a role for us elders as well within movements, but I'm so conscious of, like, yeah, of youth-led movements, and how I'm feeling, like, on a personal level, so brilliantly redundant these days. You know, like, obviously we do the work, we continue the work, we're there, but also, you know, there's, yeah, this emergent generations of amazing organizers. And I'd say, just in reflection to your point there, or your reflection, Alice, I'd also, the cynical part of me thinks that the reason, you know, sometimes when institutions or filmmakers or you know, NGOs, etc., sort of look for these tokenized voices, you know, to almost sort of tick that box of inclusion, you know, is because if they go to a peer vis-a-vis those formalized studies, you know, from us, you know, if somebody in mental health, somebody, you know, in film to somebody in film, that maybe the person will say no it's not okay, because there's a different parity of power, I think, than sort of approaching, you know, somebody who, you know, you're expecting to speak as this homogenized, essentialized voice for an entire community. So there is something in terms of, again, sort of calling to account, and in a way, like these different iterations of this, you know, that I think when things become codified, when things become, you know, to a certain degree more policy based, and there's this rollout of, you know, the logos and, you know, the white papers and the, yeah, interestingly called the white papers, etc., in terms of policy, which is very much horror, you know, that again, that generative process, you know, of radical accountability is lost, because then people go back into their comfort zone of thinking, okay, I've self-educated to a certain degree, I've ticked, you know, these various, you know, sort of ethical duty of care boxes, and now I'm okay, and now I can keep on pushing this idea, which, you know, yeah, you know, and because I suppose definitely in sort of film representation or documentary or journalism, I see so much of that pushiness. So people are telling people, they're telling them bodily, they're telling them verbally, they're telling them, you know, in their hesitation, in their pauses, that no, they don't want to be interviewed, or, you know, no, this doesn't feel comfortable. But it always causes me, yeah, a sort of a protective feeling of pain when I witness, in a way, I think, an advantage taking oftentimes of cultural politeness, you know, where people don't want to say no because they're afraid of offending or hurting, and then people sort of using that as a way to sort of push their way into getting the interview, into getting the soundbite, into getting the image, when if there was a more attuned presence, you know, of, and again, I think that goes back to ethics, but it also goes back to seeing human beings beyond, you know, the sort of flashbulb moment of that crisis and of that trauma, into, you know, beings for whom, parents for whom, you know, this will be present in an online archive that their children will look up at some stage down the road, you know, and see their parents in a moment of profound crisis or pain or trauma. And that question of, like, you know, these images that come to define people, and how difficult it is. And I think a lot of people who have been defined by images, I'm thinking here of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, you know, I'm thinking of Vietnam, I'm thinking, you know, of images of extreme suffering from many different contexts, oftentimes of children, you know, images that the same image collectors would not take in their countries of origin of their children or their community's children, but how those go on to define people, and the legacy of that, the psychological legacy of that, in terms of our continually evolving identities, the reductive, you know, sort of impact of that. So yeah, it's really, and again, my mind is going back to, maybe I'm sort of stuck on it today, but that whole concept of consent forms, you know, of reducing down such a complex relationship, such a sacred relationship in terms of actual consent for portrayals, you know, of complexity, into signing your name on a piece of paper with a date. And that somehow gives, you know, those who are archiving it the right to have that footage, to use that footage, to potentially frame that footage in a way that is injurious to your struggle, injurious to your community, injurious, you know, to your personhood, and your sense of dignity. But yeah, lots of questions. But it's, again, I think, as Ala and Sandrine said, it's out there, and in an age of social media, you know, the young creative folks who are, you know, really our teachers in this are so, you know, easy to form network with, and it's just putting in that extra bit of work, you know, to make sure that that space is made and honored really deeply as well.
I think even with ethics, we need to, the person that is photographing or documenting or anything needs to ask themselves, if they were in that position, would they like it for themselves? And it's as easy as that. It's something like, I think when we talk about ethics, we might like talk about it loads and everything, but it's as easy as asking yourself, would you like to be in that spot? The way you're documenting, would would you see any of your individual people that are in your close circle in that kind of position? And when I'm saying this, I'm thinking of the Kurdish kid that was swept onto the beach, and that became a viral image. But imagine the parents, and every single time they see that photograph, the grief they go through. And it's putting yourself in that position, I think.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I think it even goes back to your point, Quiva, of understanding the word no, because again, I think we're at this moment where, again, there's like this push for like, okay, so you're saying that Ireland is not diverse and it's not inclusive. So like, let's get all these stories out there. But again, not everyone in these marginalized community wants to tell their story, or again, like even wants to tell it in the specific medium that you're looking for. And it's to really, really understand that. And again, like as we were talking about it, like from the very start, like a lot of these concepts of retelling, like they are traumatizing. And again, like what's the benefit of that person re-traumatizing themselves for what? To prove that like racism exists in Ireland, to prove that you have to view me as a human being. So a lot of the times there is power in understanding no. And again, when someone says that, then it really should be like a self-reflection of what Alice is saying, to be like, what way did I frame that question? Like, what way did I do it that they said no? And how can I learn from that experience? So then if I go to a different community, I'll ask them in a specific and different manner, where again, maybe I didn't emphasize in the fact that you can back out at any moment. Maybe I didn't emphasize on the fact that this would be collaborative and you learn something. And again, there's something for you for revealing this trauma. And I think that's something that, yeah, like if the audience was to take away something today, would be that, like the power of collaboration, but then the power of also understanding how the power and the story of retelling can be told from such different magnitude and different spectrums of like whether it's film, literature, art, anything like that. So again, is if you are like trying to engage with certain communities or anything like that, is find out which medium best represents them and best allows them to retell this story without re-traumatizing them. And again, if they say no, then just respecting that and not, as Kiva was saying, like, yeah, kind of guilt tripping them into this sense. Because I think, I know from my experience, like if I've said no to something, it's like, but were you not saying that you need more diverse voices and you need, I'm like, yeah, but I'm exhausted mentally and emotionally. I don't want to do that. So like, again, like that's a way of like kind of pushing me to do that. But I'm like, again, for me, I know to say no, but other community members might not know to say no, because maybe they could be like, this was the one opportunity that we had to expose X and Y. But again, like to really understand when someone says no, to take that as a definitive no, and then maybe reframe your practice or reframe, I don't know, the questions and the ethics around that before you go and ask someone else.
Well, and I think even a fundamental question for the maker to ask of themselves is, why am I choosing to do this project? Why am I doing this work, this particular work? Should I be doing? Am I able to do this? Are there other people who for whom this is the work that they should be doing? So, and then it moves on. Well, what other work can I be doing, right? So when people, if people say no or whatever, it's sort of like, that's the first, well, before you even start, like for me, before I even start asking, what is my stake in this? Why am I compelled to do this work? Is there other ways that I can fulfill whatever the wider project that this is part of? Or how can my work contribute to something that's already in existence? So just moving people to question, because there's this sense of like never having to question, I want to do something, and then, and it's or I've gotten funding to do this, right? And I found this a lot especially with, well, I suppose anything that has a public life to it, like documentary, you pitch your idea, and this is all again about funding. You pitch your idea to people who might fund it. So you're already feeding into whatever stereotypes and assumptions and power and privilege and institutional sort of comfort that people in power have, right? So they want it to be a certain way, you know, so it's this whole thing. And so you've already gone out with a project, you're moving it ahead without even wondering, wait, should I be doing this in the first place? And how my work and what I do is part of these wider landscapes of struggle, right? So what are the implications of how I'm doing this work for the wider struggle? You know, you can, so it goes from the micro, oh, I want to amplify a voice or create a platform for voices in this wider struggle, when what I'm trying to do affects that whole struggle. So maybe if I want to contribute to the wider struggle, not just get an individual story kind of for my own profit sort of thing. So all of these questions about why are you doing what you're doing? Is there a better way that that can be done, even if it doesn't include you? So yeah, those types of questions, as well as how you are questioning the people that you want the story from.
Just onto that point, I think each artist or a documentary or filmmaker or whatever it is need to be okay with their losses. So if you don't get that, and prepare yourself for that no answer instead of preparing yourself for a yes answer. And even the yes answer might turn into a no. And being okay with that and being patient, I think, is the most important thing before going into a project, to think of all these things. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a definite strong point to make. And like, again, it kind of goes back to what Quiva was saying, in the sense of, again, like understanding the concept of no. And even as you're saying, because again, like some people might sign a consent form, but like in that consent form, like one of the things should be like, you're allowed to back out at any point, because again, I know from experience of like even constructing questions that I might ask, I wouldn't know, again, like the appropriate manner of it until I start talking to the person, because again, I might be like, I'll have to change this question. This is not going to work for X and Y. And again, by asking those questions, it might just be like, no, this is too much. And as you say, like if they leave, then you have to be okay with that, because again, like if you're trying to create this medium, then like, and create this powerful aspect of it, like it has to be a collaborative experience. And again, a student, you have to understand like the aftermath of the people that you're talking about. So that's really important. And I'm just conscious of time, so just for like closing remarks, would you have like just again Ala or Quiva, whoever wants to start first, and just kind of telling the audience in regards to like the power of retelling and the responsibility that they have just going forward. Ala, do you want to start?
Apologies on the background. To think of everything, like I said earlier, put yourself in the position, think if it's okay, continue on talking to the people that you have interviewed or have collaborated with and everything, making sure everything is okay, being okay with the losses, like everything I've said, and what Quiva has said. Think before you do anything. I think we all do think, but sometimes we're not conscious of the things we might do. So just be conscious of everything, and that's all I wanted to say.
I'd say maybe as a final reflection to participants who are joining us as well, because yeah, it would be lovely to know your stories and your histories and your engagement and your practice. And yeah, hopefully in the next time, the names that are on here that we meet, that it will be more of a reciprocal conversation as well. But I'd say as well as, you know, all the ground that we've tried to cover today in the sense of accountability and, you know, ethos sort of grounded in yeah, much just deeper, sort of layers. And I think Ala's question answered all of this, so profoundly in terms of putting oneself in the place of those, that you're walking alongside, in terms of how they will be presented, and would you be comfortable, being presented in such a way. And I'd say as well as those as well, to hold imaginative space for how beautiful it could be to do things differently, how beautiful it could be to co-create a space, of more authentic, accountable, generative, empowering storytelling. And instead of people sort of, I think, because I think people get defensive in this, but instead of that perception that this is an attack on personal sort of practice, it's an invitation for us collectively to do things differently, to call ourselves to account, to have that process of reflection, and potentially to co-create something that goes much deeper and wider, and has more texture and life, and beauty than what's been oftentimes done until now, vis-a-vis one sort of form, which is documentary, that isn't self-represented, that isn't self-authored, because there's many beautiful, powerful examples, obviously, of that body of work, which is, but it is still comparatively small compared to, just bigger funded, oftentimes outsider-driven, sort of white authored, documentary form, vis-a-vis communities that are surviving or enduring or suffering or resisting. But yeah, so I'd say just to hold that space, that we can create something much better, and how brilliant, to be alive in these times of being able to do so, being able to learn from Ala and Sandrine and Alice, I really think of, even though you negated your intergenerational wisdom whenever I share a space with you, I'm really struck by how much there is to learn, from generation to generation in terms of what we co-create, and to do it better, just to really, really do it better. But it was a real pleasure to share this space with you. So thank you, Sandrine and Alice and Ala. Gracias. Y shukran.
Well, what a beautiful and wonderful way to end, to draw to a pause. Sorry, that's a dog trying to scratch through a plastic cone. Okay, hang on a sec. But what a great way to just, we'll pause our conversation from here, because it's going to be an ongoing project and an ongoing discussion, and obviously ongoing life works for all of us. So hopefully we'll be able to, we've got plans, Sandrine and I, and some others.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to thank Quiva and Ala, and again, Smashing Times, for providing the platform for me and Alice. Yeah, as I say, this is just the beginning, and I think there's so much food to thought that I was just crazy writing down all of the points that were coming. And again, as you say, Quiva, there's such a beauty in just the future approach of how, again, to just live in a world where, again, these artistic practices are following the ethics, and as what Alice said, again, providing and amplifying skills with the people that you're participating with. I think those are the two key points that I take away from this. And yeah, as Alice said, this is just the beginning, so I would love to continue on this conversation. So thank you so much for again, Smashing Times, and for everyone that tuned in today. Thank you.